Okay, I've got 2 o'clock. Let's get rolling. Hopefully, there'll be some other people that come on in and will catch us as we start to talk about what we're going to go over today. We have a packed session. There's so much going on in the world of SBA and franchise lending, and it's changing all the time. So we got some stuff that, broke in the last couple of weeks. We got some new stuff that just came in the last couple of days that we're going to go over today. We're really going to touch on a lot of different issues, and we even added something in the last 24 hours that I didn't have in the table of contents and sort of the rundown as of yesterday. Hello, Alexis Hamilton. Good to see you in the chat. So what are we going to talk about today? Why are we here? We're going to start with the franchisor side of the franchise economy, and we're going to start with some really great information and findings from the IFA convention, as well as 2 reports that FRANdata has published on behalf of the IFA. The first is the 2025 Economic Outlook, and the second is our 2025 Franchisor Survey, which actually just hit the presses from IFA yesterday. So get your phones ready for this webinar. We're going to have QR codes as we go through for each of those reports. So if you want to download the Economic Outlook, you'll be able to do that. And the Franchisor Survey, you're going to see QR codes on these slides as we go, so you'll be able to get those. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the Economic Outlook just because we previously had done a webinar. This came out right around the conference, so about 2 weeks ago now, and Edith Wiseman of FRANdata, our president, just did a webinar on the Economic Outlook. So I have a couple of slides on that because I want to go over some top level stuff. That's really looking at what's happening in the franchise space, what we expect for 2025. The Franchisor Survey just came out yesterday, and this is super interesting because it's a lot of information that we get and gather from franchisor executives. So not the franchisees that you're lending to, but the folks that are running the organizations, the franchisors that are selling these units and collecting the royalties. And some of the folks out there listening that are in biz dev, these are the folks that you're actually engaging with and trying to develop direct lending relationships with. So it's really important to understand what they're thinking about and what's important to them. And we're going to talk a little bit about the convention. Then we want to dive into the SBA. We've got some portfolio stats on franchising, and I want to talk a little bit about the 2025 lending environment as it pertains to what we've learned at IFA and some things that we are anticipating this year. We're also going to take a look at Administrator Leffler's Day One letter, which just came out 2 days ago, and I was looking at it today, and there were some interesting points in there that I just thought I wanted to go over. Not a lot of conclusions really from that, but some interesting things that I think we all in SBA need to pay attention to. Then we're going to dive into the here and now, navigating eligibility and credit issues within the agreements. So we're going to look at a couple of examples of things that we've seen and touch on FRANdata, our eligibility certification, but more broadly, what's going on in SBA eligibility. We're going to talk about the current state, but there are some potential changes that are coming. Some of that stuff came out of IFA as well, so we'll talk about that. Then we're going to look at a couple of case examples of credit issues that were identified in agreements by lenders. So when we talk about eligibility, we're going to talk about affiliation, but there are credit issues in agreements and also some case examples of language that you need to pay attention to, specifically step-in rights, transfers, and liquidated damages. A couple of examples of some things in franchise agreements that are causing some issues for lenders now. And then we're going to talk about the underwriting side of things. The Day One letter by Kelly Loeffler talked about, prudent underwriting and the idea of do what you do, which seems like it's going to be changing. But what does the SOP today say about prudent lending to franchise loans, and how do you do that? And that's a great transition into our fund reports. FRANdata does franchise underwriting. We have a credit report called the Fund Report, which is very much like a FICO score for a franchise brand. I want to take a look at a coffee sector brand called Big Coffee, more to sort of introduce and let people become familiar with the Fund Report, but also because the coffee sector has been pretty hot lately, and some of our subscribing lenders have asked a lot about that. So it's topical. Of course, we'll have time for questions at the end, but if you have questions as we go, and I can see some questions already about the recordings and slides, that stuff will happen. But any questions you have about the content, we can touch on them as we go, or we can leave them for the end. So we'll make sure to address those. Now, I want to talk about the IFA convention, and the slides that are on here about the economic outlook. But more broadly, the convention is just a really great event that happens every single year, that is really coming together of franchisees, of franchisors, of suppliers. Of course, FRANdata is a supplier. You folks out there that are lenders are suppliers. But it's a great place to sort of kick off the year and establish connections with our lending partners and also to develop new relationships with franchisors. Now, it's not an event for everybody that's on this call. But if you're a bank that's making, heavier commitments to franchise lending, take a look at that event because it's a really, really solid way to get your people out there and to sort of kick off your year in franchise lending. One of the things that I took away from the keynotes specifically at IFA was what they were talking about were the keys, the major keys to franchising and franchisor success. And the reason that these were important for me was that they really paralleled a lot of the things that we sort of preach and we look at FRANdata. So what were the things that they listed were the top things that were keys for franchising success? They were transparency, unit economics, and this idea of cash on cash returns, right? What's the return that the folks are actually going to be pulling out of this system? And it was really refreshing to hear that this keynote speaker thought that the numbers and the performance are really the most important thing, and moreover, the transparency. And we know that when we deal with franchise lending, we deal with transparency all the time. So these are really great messages that were being put out there to the franchisor community. But it's also important to know that not every brand attends this event and hears these types of positive messages. So later in the presentation, we're going to talk about emerging brands and newer brands and how we deal with them and the things we should expect. Know that they're not always hearing the same messages that IFA is putting out. They're not always doing things the way they should be done. So really important messages, but take those home to the deals that you're doing and the types of things that you're looking at. Franchise directory, the SBA franchise directory was discussed at the conference. There was a breakout session that was hosted by Ron Feldman, who I think signed up for this session. Ron, if you're out there, shout out to Ron. That's Mr. Feldman to everyone else on the call. Really, what was disappointing about that was that there really weren't that many franchisors that attended that SBA session, but it was a discussion between Ron Feldman and Steve O'Lear, the Chief Franchise Counsel of SBA. He came to the conference just talking about the current environment and what is going on in terms of conversations about bringing back the SBA franchise directory. There were a lot of questions in our webinar sign up about, is it coming back? What's happening with that? The long and the short of that is that there are discussions happening now about bringing back the franchise directory. They're happening between IFA, between the SBA, between NAGL and other stakeholders. Nothing has been decided yet. So as of this webinar, we're still operating on the current SOP and the procedures for franchise lending, but that is being discussed seriously. And Feldman, you said Mr. Feldman's his father. Good point. Noted. Nothing's been decided yet, but they're working on it. So really, it's a stay tuned message, but it's really important for lenders to sort of pay attention to that. We personally think that having more clarity is a better thing for banks. So that's sort of our opinion on the directory. Now, in terms of the reporting, I said right around the time that IFA came out, we presented our 2025 economic outlook, and this is where FRANdata gives lift to the IFA and does research into the broad franchising community and what we think the outlook is going to be for the next year in relation to the rest of the economy. And really, we're seeing continued growth. One of the great things about the franchise space is it does tend to grow and perform ahead of the rest of the economy and is sort of a leader in that way. We expect the unit growth to continue. So establishments, we expect a 2.5% increase in total unit openings. A lot of the survey that we're going to look at talks about employment and some of the challenges that franchisors are facing. But we do expect to see employment and franchising increase and the overall output to increase as well. So it's not just about the new units that are going to be opening, it's about the existing operators sort of recovering and doing even better as we're now fully beyond the COVID period, now going into 2025. When we break that down by sector and industry, I highlighted a couple of these just because I know these are the ones that lenders are asking us about a lot. QSR restaurants, we expect them to grow in 2025 about 2.2%, but they're not leading the charge. Something that we saw happen around the pandemic was an increase in both business services, B2B, and personal service franchise businesses. And you can see those personal services have continued to grow, and we expect a really big increase again in 2025. You're also going to see some slides about commercial and residential services. That's again, similar thing. So a big theme around service-based businesses for the last couple of years. And I'm sure the lenders that are on the call have seen similar things in terms of the requests that have been coming in. Certainly from our subscribers, we've seen something to that effect. So just want to show a couple of top line slides from the economic outlook. Again, we've done a couple webinars on this already. If you want to look at the entire report, it's really dense. There's a lot of great stuff in there. And maybe if you're doing, internal analysis of the franchise space, or you're, trying to maybe do a white paper internally about why we should be in franchise lending, great resource for you guys there. So grab that with the QR code. Alongside that economic outlook, we actually do a survey of franchisor executives, understand what their key challenges are, what are they facing. And this one we just put out yesterday. So I even myself, I haven't spent as much time with this as I wanted to. I got some of the key findings, and I thought we could go through and just look at some of the slides to sort of see some of the detail in this. But the largest percentage of respondents identified labor as one of their top business concerns, quantity and availability, and we're going to look at the breakdowns of those. 15% of the respondents are worried about poor sales as a concern. And this is something that I've seen in the fund reports in the unit economics, where even the strongest brands, the brands that have, 700 score or better, they're doing really well. Even the brands that are top performers have seen some pressure in the bottom line profitability in that unit economics number. And so you can see the executives in personal services and QSR are concerned about poor sales. These are the folks that are projected to grow among the highest if you look back to the previous slide. So even in the systems and the sectors that are projected to do really well, there's some concern about bottom line profitability. We're going to look at unfilled job vacancies, has improved a little bit. It's still an issue, but the brands that have been reported unfilled vacancies has dropped. But 48% of the brands do expect total employment to increase versus 40% expecting it to stay the same. So we have issues with labor, but we're still demanding more labor. When that demand for personnel and for growth hasn't abated. So it's still going to be an issue this year. And some of the things that really concerned folks in the previous years have sort of reshuffled a little bit. And you'll see that where inflation was one of the major concerns. Now it's sort of ranked 2 and 3 versus some of these other issues that are more acutely related to labor and cost of equipment and opening these franchise businesses. So the top line was, hey, quality of labor and availability and cost of labor were sort of combined together. If you're looking at what the single biggest issues are, sales and inflation, you can see inflation dropped to number 3 in terms of the most important problems for franchisors, so the folks that are owning these brands that are facing. Again, different QR code now. So this is the QR code for the franchisor survey. And we've got a lot packed in, so I don't want to spend too much on each slide, but you can go into some of the specifics there just by downloading that. So again, inflation concerns eased. What replaced it? Poor sales, right? So that bottom line unit economics was the major factor that overtook inflation. Of course, that was the big hot button issue in 22 and 23. Now we're looking back internally to our own systems and worried about unit economics. The concerns over quality or availability of labor doubled in 2025, right? So we did the same survey last year. Quality of the labor was the biggest concern this year versus last year. The actual ability not to just get bodies, but to get quality bodies. And I think Edith had a session or something that she did recently where she had interviewed a franchisor that said that they will hire 4 times the amount of unskilled labor into a unit to then end up with the amount of employees that they're going to need because the turnover is so high in the unskilled labor pool. So that's something that we're seeing. Overall difficulties across the whole respondents group in terms of filling those openings, the difficulty response is down. So it's improving a little bit, is sort of say this. This is not to say that the problems are behind us, but where, franchisors are really, really screaming, this is the biggest problem, and everybody across the board was having it, that has metered a little bit. So we're down to 70% in terms of the respondents that said that overall that labor were an issue, and 11% were the ones that were in that unskilled group that we were just talking about in the previous slide. Again, to labor, 3 times more executives came in and said that they have job openings that they are not able to fill. So do they have job openings that they can't fill? We have a big increase in that. So that is continued to tick up over the years as the ability to find these folks, the concern around that. So this is sort of the manifestation of the inability to find folks that we've seen in the previous years. Qualified candidates is also a significant challenge. So this difference between skilled versus unskilled labor, and you can sort of think about that in, what types of brands my franchisee borrower are opening. Are we opening, restaurant businesses that, maybe just have some food service and that kind of thing, or are we doing things like construction where you might have roofing, or lawn care or something like that that might need a specialist, or maybe it's American Family Care where we're hiring medical professionals. Understand what your potential franchisee borrower needs in terms of skilled and unskilled labor can help you get a sense of what they're going to face in the market. But again, folks do think that total employment is going to increase. So they're having these headwinds in terms of being able to find people to hire, but we still have the growth goals in terms of franchise development. So even though they're finding problems hiring people, we still expect the total employment within units to increase. How are they dealing with these labor challenges? They're doing it in lots of different ways. Some of them are changing wages. Some of them are changing benefits. Some of them are changing employee scheduling. Some of them are actually offering signing bonuses and hiring bonuses, which is something that you don't typically see, in some service-based businesses or food businesses, but a lot of them are resorting to incentives to be able to solve those problems. So franchisors are doing them in different ways. So good to understand how your borrower's brand are meeting some of these challenges and does it apply to them. And technology is, of course, going to be a big way to address this. Some of them are actually changing their models and their build out sizes, so they need less labor. Some are looking at automation and AI to address those, and some are looking at actually assisting their franchisees in the recruiting efforts. So actually coming down into market and helping them recruit and helping them get more folks in there actually on the ground. So franchisors are taking a role in this as well. We do think that labor challenges are going to at least impact new franchise unit growth in 2025. And this is the distribution of franchisor respondents that thought or didn't think that this was going to affect them. 56% of brands still think that their growth is going to be somewhat constrained due to this issue. We expect increased investment in technology to continue in 2025, as well as increased marketing spend to help these folks grow, and training and development of the individual folks as well. So they expect to increase training and development of their franchisees to help them deal with the issues that they're having with the hiring. The last couple of slides are about franchisee relationship, and these are just sort of, the franchisor saying, well, how positive is your relationship? Most of them say that they are very positive. Something to look at is, does the brand have an active franchise advisory council? That's something that we look at in the fund report. You can see about 80% of them do. And most franchisor respondents report that their relationship with franchisees is exceptionally positive. That is really, really fantastic. But to tie it all back together, what impacts this the most? Franchisors will tell you that, again, it's unit economics that most strongly impacts the franchisor-franchisee relationship, which is, again, the relationship your borrower is going to have with that franchisor. And so it really just ties right back to the keynote gentleman that said, hey, what's most important? Unit economics and cash on cash returns. Well, we come back to it again in the survey. That's the most important factor that determines happy franchisees. So there's a lot more in this. We just blown right through the franchisor study, but go ahead and download it with the QR code. There's a lot of great stuff there. And it's just, again, get you in the mind of the franchisor. When we're underwriting deals, we're looking at the borrower, we're looking at specific locations, but get in the head of the brand, and what's going on with the franchisor can give you a great perspective on what's happening with the brand. And take a peek at the questions just real quick. Nothing new. All right, fantastic. I want to shift now to look at the lending environment and franchising and SBA. And just a couple of slides on what's happening and, are we in an uptrend? Are we in a downtrend? If you look at the publicly available data, if we do a FOIA request and we get the SBA 7A, we get the 504 data, and we look at the franchise information, you might think that there's a downtrend in franchise lending because there is a reduction in the total number, there's a reduction in the total number of loans that have been made in the lending amount. But with the elimination of the franchise directory by SBA in May 23, which is playing into this session as well, they also eliminated the requirement to report on franchise loans, to actually tag the franchise loan that you're making to the SBA code that was previously established and that was part of that franchise directory. So the result is that in the last 2 years, there's a serious level of underreporting in the SBA portfolio for franchise lending. So if we just look at the SBA, the publicly available franchise data, it's going to look like there's a lot less franchise lending that's actually happening. But in reality, and from what we're seeing and from the folks that are subscribing to FRANdata, that amount of franchise lending has either stayed the same or in many cases for our subscribers has gone up. So we know there's a level of underreporting in the SBA portfolio. That's the one issue that we're dealing with. But there's also sort of a concentration in terms of franchise lending. We looked at the environment in 2024, knowing that there's a lack of transparency, that there's some reporting issues there. There were 558 lenders that made 5,635 loans to franchise businesses. 4,174 of those were made by the top 10% of lenders. And about 74% of that group were made by 56 lenders. So clearly the folks on the call here that are paying attention to this are in franchise lending, but a lot of that activity is happening in some concentrated groups, which to me says that there are some folks out there that do some franchise lending, maybe do a couple of loans, maybe don't do a ton of volume. So they might not have access to the same level of information that the subscribing lenders that we have that are doing all this activity can leverage through FRANdata and other sources. But with that, about 60% of the franchise loans that are being done today are from banks that rely on the fund report, and those banks have over $5 trillion in assets. So a really large percentage of the SBA franchise group are coming from banks that are relying on our underwriting and our fund reports and scores on franchise performance. And we're going to talk about that later. We're going to talk about how that fits into the current SOP. But important to think about that as we go into now looking at the day one letter by Administrator Leffler. So I want to take a look at some interesting things there because she makes a point about underwriting and talks about do what you do, but this idea of prudent lending and what does that mean really plays into everything that goes into doing these franchise loans. We're going to talk about it later in terms of what do we need to do. So this came out on the 24th. I just spent a little bit of time with it this morning, and Administrator Leffler was confirmed, and she came out with a day one letter saying what are her priorities, what is she going to be looking at. The first couple of these are sort of aligning with the current administration and their efforts and what they want to get accomplished. But where I really started to sort of focus in was when we're talking about doing an agency-wide financial audit. So I just want to jump right down to number 7, eliminating wasteful spending and cracking down on fraud. We're going to conduct an agency-wide financial audit. The issue is that the perception of fraud has risen, so to have delinquencies, defaults, and charge-offs. And this was exacerbated, as this letter says, by the previous administration's lax loan underwriting, servicing, and collection efforts. Anytime I see underwriting, servicing, and collection, and it's lax, I'm thinking about what kinds of rules and things are going to be put into the future of the SBA based on this. What's the goal of this? To preserve the solvency of public-private programs like the 7(a) lending program. To my knowledge, the SBA program is a zero subsidy program or has been for many of its years. So I think we're well positioned to continue the program and to let folks know that this has been running for many years and that it's a zero subsidy program. So I'm sure we'll be able to deal with that. Here's where it starts to get a little interesting for me, and I think we should all on this call pay attention, that SBA will restore its underwriting standards, ensuring taxpayer dollars go only to supporting eligible small businesses across America. How are we going to do that? We're going to conduct a full review of the current lending SOPs, ending the do what you do standard for lending, which, my God, that one was one of those ones we've been wrestling with for a while. So we're going to do a full review of the SOP. We're going to end do what you do, and we're going to enhance oversight of non-bank lenders. Some of this stuff folks have been calling for a long time. Obviously, enhancing oversight of non-bank lenders was a big hot button issue at many SBA conferences that I have been to. But where I start to get a little concerned is, okay, we're ending the do what you do. So maybe we're going to get some clarity here in terms of prudent lending. Maybe we're going to get a little bit of clarity in terms of what actually should be done when there's a franchise loan, when there's any kind of loan, really. There's a line here banning illegal aliens from receiving SBA assistance, restricting hostile foreign nationals from accessing SBA assistance. This is one where I sort of thought, well, okay, we went specifically, said similarly, we're going to make sure that the agency implements measures to prevent hostile foreign nationals, especially those with ties to the CCP, from accessing assistance. Is that going to be a lender thing? Is the lender going to be responsible for doing a background check? Is the SBA going to set up, some sort of a process by which we can submit folks and then have that done? So, we're concerned right now about affiliation, right? And the affiliation part of it really comes in here, ensuring taxpayer dollars only go to supporting eligible small businesses across America. That's what the franchise directory was all about, was this affiliation question. Was there too much control of the franchisor over the franchisee? So it looks like we're looking at all these issues. Do what you do is on the chopping block. And in this mix is the SBA franchise directory. And you could read the directory on both sides of this. You could read that as too much regulation, but you could also read that as giving enhanced oversight for banks to better do their jobs and better administrate the SBA program. So this is just the beginning. This is the beginning of a long journey this year. We always talk about, when we talk about SBA rules and regs and processes, that they are subject to change. Certainly that has turned out to be the case with the do what you do standard. But one of the things that we do at FRANdata is make sure that we're always tracking these issues. We're out front of this stuff. Again, I mentioned that this was talked about at IFA. We have a lender conference coming up the first of the year, the Georgia Lender Quality Circle, GLQC. And I'm sure this is going to be a topic there as well. So by communicating with us, by staying on our mailing list, you're going to get updated on this kind of stuff. And of course, coming to our webinars where we're going to break this down as soon as we have more concrete answers, where as of right now, we don't have that clarity. We don't know where this is going just yet. We're staying in the eligibility sphere here. And I want to talk about what we've been experiencing with eligibility. There's a lot of different things, but the long and the short of it with the SBA franchise directory and it being removed is that lenders are responsible for doing the reviews of eligibility for their franchise loans. The two examples I'm going to show you are what happened when deals were sent into GP. So a lender said, hey, we don't know if we can do this. We're going to send it in GP. And we're going to, Ryan Pendleton, you got the GLQC shout out. You're the man. We love you. They sent this in GP to get reviewed for eligibility. But one of the things that came back with this is for a brand called Game Day Men's Health. The screen out letter said at the bottom, number 2, lender to confirm if this is an SBA approved franchise. So lenders are responsible for reviewing deals for eligibility. That is the bottom line of the absence of the SBA directory. Some lenders feel more comfortable doing it than others. Some lenders that don't feel comfortable are engaging outside counsel. That is costing extra money. That is costing extra time. But that is the major issue that we're seeing with Game Day Men's Health. Now, the other point on this was that they had noted a business model eligibility issue, a prejudicial concern with Game Day Men's Health. But if we went back to the SBA directory, the old one, right, which is, again, taken offline in May 2023, but copies of it have been preserved and lenders have downloaded them. If we go back to that SBA directory, there is no mention of a gender discrimination issue in the eligibility notes. So if we went back to the old directory and used it to prove that this was eligible, they wouldn't have been in this case. So all that is to say that just relying on that old listing from 2023 isn't enough, especially as we get farther and farther away from the franchise agreements that were approved in 2023. Remember, now we're in 25, and we're going to see the new agreements coming in the next couple of months, March, April, May. So double point there. 1, SBA is not doing the reviews, even if you send them GP. 2, the franchise directory may not have everything, especially now because agreements have changed. And the second screen out letter was also with Game Day Men's Health. So screen out letter 1 made it clear the SBA will not give an opinion on eligibility. It's up to the lender. Screen out letter 2 raises similar issues, but with different language. Okay, so this one said it was submitted in, and this one said, hey, you provide your assessment of eligibility, especially with respect to patronage, with Game Day Men's Health. So they're saying, hey, the name seems to suggest that the borrower services are provided to men only, and the LGPC does not provide an opinion on franchise eligibility. Please contact your local district office for more information regarding the review process. What happened there? They went to the district office, they sent them back to the SOP, and the loop was complete. But this is the just to tell you that the SBA, as of today, unless we make a change, unless the directory comes back, is not reviewing the eligibility piece. It is up to the lender to determine franchise eligibility. So the next question obviously becomes, well, what do we do in these cases? How do we determine eligibility? And moreover, what is FRANdata doing to help us with this? What we are doing, and we have shown on many webinars that you have been on last year, is we are doing a franchise eligibility certification that is signed by the franchisor. Think about it a lot like a certificate of no material and non-material change if you were around back in those days. But what this document does, and we're going to do a screen share of franchise registry in a sec, it lists all of the non-affiliation provisions that we have found in previous SBA directory listings, consultations with SBA, looking at those eligibility notes that we talked about, and is getting the franchisor to sign and attest that their agreement does not violate any of these non-affiliation eligibility issues. Non-disturbance in torment language is one. The bathrooms and changing rooms issues that we just looked at with Game Day Men's Health. I typically talk about Kerr's Fitness for Women on that one. So those are the types of issues that we're talking about. So FRANdata's solution to this is to get this document signed by the franchisor. They sign it for each agreement year that they have, and we list it on franchise registry for download and use with your deal. What that looks like is this page here, and I'm going to do a quick tab over so we can see how to actually search that on franchise registry. Let's get in. The website is franchiseregistry.com. If you are a lender hearing my voice, or you have a friend that's a lender, you can get access to franchise registry for free if you are a lender. Now, that doesn't mean you have access to everything here. You have access to a lot of things. Our fund reports, our 4Pay reports, and things like that, those are for our subscribers only. But if you are a franchise lender, you will be able to get a login for our site to be able to find franchisors that have the certification and download it. You will also be able to download their most recent franchise disclosure document, as well as get some other information about the brand. We charge them a small yearly fee. It's under $1,000 to list their information, have their FDD. We'll create their fund report. We share it with them. We'll let them know where they're strong and where they're weak, and then we list them on the site. So when you have a deal for a brand, you can come in here and search. I'm going to search for sport clips. So I think I could even search for sport, but I'm going to search sport clips. And when I do, it's going to find the brand. It's going to deposit me on the homepage for the concept. And I'm going to take you to where the eligibility certification is. But just so you know here, when you're able to access the brand, there's key contact information here as well that is provided by the franchisor. Franchise financing is a contact that you can reach out to for any underwriting questions about a package. Franchise sales is a biz dev contact. Sometimes it's the same person. As you can see here, I will not try to pronounce that name. And the third contact is the SBA contact, and that can be thought of as someone who can help you with the process stuff. Signed franchise agreement prior to first disbursement of funds is really the biggest one. But if you need to talk to the brand for anything, don't go through the borrower, through an intermediary to the franchisor. Come on here, get the contact information, and reach out. So that's what you have just on the general tab. But I want to draw your attention to the underwriting tab. Now, what you're seeing here is the full subscriber access, but so you won't have access to fund reports, but what you will be able to do is to download the most recent FDD and to then download the eligibility certification that the brand has listed on our site. And so specifically for Sport Clips, this is for their 2024 FDD. You saw they had 2023, they did 2024, 2025 is going to come out in a couple of months. They'll do this again. Forming the agreement is the Sport Clips Incorporated. All these eligibility concerns and issues that are, again, non-affiliation, they're attesting that these are not present in their agreement. And the bottom of this document is signed by the VP of Finance. Again, I'm not going to pronounce. But this is available on Franchise Registry, so that if you have a deal for them, you can download it and use it. There's no cost for this. This is a service being provided by the franchisor to make the process easier for lenders, thereby faster and better for their franchisees. Not every brand is doing this. Not every brand cares. Not every brand thinks they have a problem with SBA, but we are going out to franchisors on your behalf. So if you come in here through this process, you get to the underwriting tab and you see, okay, no certification or no 2024 or now no 2025. Reach out to FRANdata. You're going to see this email here, franchiseregistry@frandata.com. You can email me. There's some other folks you can email. We will go out to that franchisor, talk to them about the need, and get them to sign, or at least try to get them to sign the eligibility certification so that you can get it through here. If they don't want to do that, then you're going to have to do an individual review, or you're going to get to a third-party counsel or attorney. Some of them are on our call today. They do fantastic work, but they're out there. But there are a lot of franchise loans that are going, and it can take a lot of time. So look at this as soon as you can when you have a deal that comes in. Make sure that you look to see what we have and what we don't, and give us a little lead time to get to the brand. If they're super responsive and they're engaging, we could turn it around in about a week or two. If they're ticklish about the language and it has to get in front of attorneys, then it might take a little bit longer. So just make sure that we have enough lead time to figure that out, which is something you should be doing anyway when a deal comes in and we have to assess eligibility. All right, we're about halfway through. Let's check some questions. All right. Moving on to credit issues in agreements. I wanted to give a couple of examples of credit issues that we found in franchise agreements. And this is sort of adjacent to affiliation in that these affiliation issues, these elements of control, while now thrown out by SBA, they might come back, but they're thrown out by SBA. Those are control issues, but there also can be credit issues too, right? So when SBA was talking about eligibility, this affiliation issue was excessive control so that we were no longer a small business person, but those elements of control can still affect the credit package and the ability of the borrower to pay me back if things go wrong. And that's the example that I wanted to show here, with a bank that came to us with a struggling borrower with a loan to a car wash franchise. I'm going to give you sort of the framework of it, and then we'll go into some specifics. But they had made a loan to a borrower that opened a car wash franchise. It was Tommy's Express Car Wash. They did it in Las Vegas. And it was a new loan. It was maybe open like a year, maybe less. And the borrower was struggling and they wanted to sell the real estate and all the business assets to a new buyer. And this sale was like a lifeline. The borrower found a new buyer. They were going to buy the real estate, the business, and the price that they had agreed to was enough to pay off the loan and pay off everybody and sort of cure the default and make everyone happy. The franchisor blocked the transaction, and they were threatening to exercise rights that the lender didn't know were in play. They didn't know that the brand could do this. And so they came to me and say, hey, the franchisor is threatening to do this and threatening to do that and like charge us a bunch of money and take the unit if this transaction moves through. They actually sent a cease and desist letter to the buyer. Now the loan was made in February 2024, so they had no benefit of the SBA directory or Form 2462, which addresses some of these step-in rights and other issues. And really ensures that the SBA has first lien position in some of this stuff. But they didn't have any of this benefit, and they sort of said, well, like, I don't understand, how did the franchisor have such expansive rights? How could they do this? And the answer was that the rights were actually conferred inside of the franchise agreement that the borrower signed. And these issues weren't an eligibility concern, but they're still a credit concern. And because the lender wasn't aware that these clauses were in the package, it caused an issue on the back end when this tried to go through. Now, what the background of this was is that the borrower was trying to sell this Tommy's business to a competitor of Tommy's, and franchisors have the right to determine and sort of give an approval of a new buyer. And in fact, some of the SBA language that talks about transfers talks about that the franchisor shall not unreasonably withhold this right? So they still allowed the franchisor to have the right of refusal in a transfer, but not to unreasonably withhold it, not to withhold it for, sort of spurious means. In this case, they were trying to sell it to a competitor. Now, the competitor was the car wash that was in Las Vegas already. They had 15 locations. Tommy's was trying to come in market, and the unit that failed was like their third or fourth unit in Las Vegas. But here's some specific language. is saying that if we, the franchisor, this is the franchise agreement. So the franchisor determines in their judgment that the operation of the business is in jeopardy, the franchisee, the borrower, had authorized Tommy's to come in and operate the business for as long as they deem necessary and practical, and that they would do it for a period of time that was in their sole discretion. You also agreed to hold harmless Tommy's for all actions, pay for all their attorney's fees incurred as a consequence of them exercising the step-in rights. They further had a right of first refusal, which we talked about, so that if you decided to sell the business, they had to submit an exact offer to Tommy's. They get 30 days from the delivery of offer, and they have the right of first refusal to actually step in and take it. Now, Tommy's didn't want to pay the price that this competitor was paying, so they're going to take this unit by other means because they're selling it to an unauthorized buyer in this, and that's partially with the right of first refusal, but also in the transfer and resale restrictions that they had in the agreement. It's saying you shall not, unless otherwise allowed, transfer any interest in the agreement or any interest in the Tommy's business without prior written approval. Again, which approval shall not be unreasonably withheld. So that unreasonably withheld clause was what SBA was worried about in the past, but this is still a credit issue. And what wound up happening was that they weren't allowed to sell. They did default on the loan, and there were liquidated damages that were involved. So again, the lender was saying, look, they're telling us that they're going to take the unit and they're going to charge my borrower $500,000. How can they do that? Well, liquidated damages says that if this unit, in the event you sell or transfer prior to the end of the agreement, and they don't execute new franchise agreements, you agree to pay Tommy's liquidated damages equal to the uncollected royalties for 1 year, 12 months times 120. So that's 10 years of uncollected royalties or 500K. Now, there was a lot layered in here that was really onerous on the borrower in the event that the loan went bad and the bank and the lender, and it was a CDC in this case, had no idea that this was even in place. So it was really, really a tough situation. Those are some examples of things that could be in the franchise agreement. There are others, but when we review agreements, understand it is an eligibility and a credit issue as well. Now, we look at this stuff in the fund report. We have a franchise agreement assessment section that pulls out these specific clauses that lenders need to pay attention to that are a credit issue, but are not quantitative issues with the numbers. The qualitative has to do with the operation of the brand. Vidal is asking, I assume then that the franchisor needs to find a buyer, or does the franchisee need to find it? Well, I think what's going to happen, and what did happen, is the franchisor just took it over and they made it a company-owned unit. So they bought it themselves. Now, typically they would buy, if they're going to purchase an underperforming unit, they're going to buy it back from the borrower. There's going to be some kind of payment because the borrower is not in default. In this case, the franchisor just came down and said, boom, you're in default. You're trying to sell this. You agreed to sell it to someone who's a competitor we didn't approve. That's what happened there. But most of the time, the franchisor can repurchase it, turn it into a company-owned unit. We're going to shift gears into underwriting, and hopefully we can stick with us till the end of this. But I want to talk about today. So we saw the letter from Administrator Leffler about where we're going in terms of do what you do is going to go, and we're going to look more at underwriting standards and maybe define some of those. But today, what do we have to sink our teeth into when it comes to prudent lending to franchise loans? The SBA SOP doesn't say a lot. If we do a control F and we search for the word franchise, it doesn't come up a lot, but it comes up in two places. One is in the 7A underwriting standards for loans greater than 500K. It also applies to cap lines and international trade. And there's like A through F of things. If you go down to item I, what it says is you need to discuss other relevant information. For example, if the application involves a franchise, as defined by the FTC, which we're not going to get into now, but if the application involves a franchise, the lender must review any credit information provided, such as the number of failed franchisees and cash flow projections provided by the franchisor. Now, I can tell you that there are about 15 different things that we would look at to determine the credit information of the brand. They gave you two. So when we go and look at the fund report, we're going to show you what it looks like to fully underwrite franchise performance. Those are two elements that you need to look at, but there's a lot more to it. They also did it in the CDC credit memorandum where they said, hey, independent studies or reports may be helpful. They go on to say, hey, it might be beneficial to mitigating any weakness identified in the credit analysis, these independent studies. Examples of these are, again, A through D, the final one, franchise assessment reports. Franchise is defined by the FTC assessment reports. What that means, we don't know, but I can tell you that we do at FRANdata a franchise assessment report called a fund report. And we're going to take a look at one on Big B Coffee in a sec, but I want to just frame it for us. I've talked a little bit about scores and high scores and this and that. What is the fund score? What does the scoring mean? It is an independent risk assessment of franchisor performance with all the publicly available information. And we're going to see there's some qualitative and quantitative measures, but when we add these up, the top score that you can get is 950. And most of our subscribing lenders and the folks that use our information will look at a top tier franchise brand at about 700 or 750 or better. That's that top tier, that cream of the crop. And then stratify from there based on their lending objectives and the rates and terms that they want to offer to franchisee borrowers. So again, that's 600 to 750 is another tier. And then 600 below, you get to your lower performing franchise brands, where again, we don't come out here and say, don't lend to a franchise brand out of hand, but consider the risk of the franchisor alongside the risk of the borrower and make sure that you pair the right brand with the right borrower, right? Generally speaking, our first-time franchisees, we want them in the higher performing 700 plus brands. And the folks that maybe have a little bit of franchise experience or a multi-unit operator might be looking into some brands that might not be doing as well. They're a turnaround story. They're going to buy a territory on the cheap and they're going to turn it around. Those are the types of stories that you're looking for in that lower band, that lower strata of fund scores. So that's the top level of the report and what's contained within it. I'm now going to flip to a screen share. This is our final element in today's call. And I want to look at the fund report for Big B Coffee, which is a $6.95. Big B Coffee is, of course, a coffee brand. They are a smaller footprint. They do coffee, tea, salads, baked goods, and they are very concentrated in the northern Midwest of the country. They came out of Michigan. East Lansing is their headquarters. So they've really grown in that box right there in sort of the Great Lakes region. But you can see they're starting to poke out into the Southeast. And a lot of the banks on this call, you'll see their footprints are right there in the Southeast. So I know that some of you folks are taking calls and hearing from the franchisees of Big B Coffee. But let's break this down. It's a 695 score. What does that mean? The categories in the fund report go through it, as I said before, both qualitative and quantitative measures. And we look at the unit information and we look at the franchisor. So by units, I mean the actual units, the locations that are operating on the ground. We're going to look at their performance. And then we're also going to look at the franchisor. We're going to look at Global Orange Development LLC, which is the company that's collecting the royalties and going to the IFA conferences and all that kind of stuff. First four categories in our fund report look at the unit performance. And the first thing that we start off with is the historical unit success. This is super important now today, especially since when we looked at the beginning and we learned that the reporting on franchise data in SBA is at its lowest rate that it's ever been. Historical unit success doesn't just look at SBA loans, but looks at all of the unit activity that's happening within the system over the last 8 years. We go into several documents, we look at lots of information to pull this stuff in. And what we focus on are units that were terminated or ceased operations other in each of those years. And then we give a compounded success rate for that brand over the last 8 years. This again is looking at all of the units that happen. So not just the SBA loans, but the SBA, conventional finance, self-finance units, everything that's happening with the units on the ground for the last 8 years, we see in historical unit success. The next three categories go further to unit performance, and we look at resale activity level, and then average unit revenue and unit economics. So top line revenue, bottom line profitability. Resale looks at the transfer activity, meaning what is the rate at which units are being sold from one franchisee to another, and is this within a favorable band of activity? So we don't want to see transfer rates too high. That has shown in our research that a spike in transfer rates can mean, not always, but can mean that franchisors are having issues in the system and they're leaving at an outsized rate. And we also don't want to see the transfer rate too low, because that can also tell us in some cases that there isn't a robust collateral resale value, right? If my borrower wants to sell, like in the Tommy's example, are there folks that are going to step forward and want to purchase or not? And that also is related to the maturity of the system. How many years have they been in operation? That's an important point there. Now, back to the keynote at IFA. What was one of the three most important things about franchising success? Transparency was the first thing. Oopsies. Transparency was the first item that they mentioned. So, what are we rating in item 19 here? Top line revenue and bottom line profitability. Transparency is first. How much information is available in that system? And then how does it benchmark against its peers? So we're looking at the publicly available disclosures. In this case, Big B Coffee gave us information for 80% of the systems. That's great transparency. And then we're benchmarking against its peers, a peer set that we define going into this. And this again reflects sort of what we talked about at the beginning, where the top line revenues are pretty solid. Big B Coffee's been around for a long time, if you go back and look at that. So when you look at the comparable brands that had a big pump in 2021, that's sort of coming out of COVID. This brand's been around a long time, so they were really able to maintain and continue really steady growth. But what we saw here, and we've seen in a lot of other brands, is again a tightening of the unit economics, where the bottom line profitability in this period went from 129K down to 85K per unit. So those profits and the profitability in a lot of these units have been squeezed. And that's important to pay attention to, because when we start to layer on royalties and marketing payments and a note payment and a loan payment and franchisee salary onto that, these profit margins can start to get obliterated down to nothing. So you want to pay attention to that. From there, the fund report goes into the franchisor level. So remember Global Orange Development, and we start with a qualitative measure called franchisor-franchisee relationship. That looks at any bankruptcies and litigations that might be happening, or franchisor suing the franchisee or vice versa. Recurring revenue looks at franchisor income. So is Global Orange Development, the franchisor, are they collecting enough money from their recurring revenue streams and their royalty streams to pay their ongoing expenses? Or do they have to open up a lot of new units and get those paying royalties to become recurring revenue self-sufficient? It's not the whole story of a franchise brand, but it's a big piece of it. Now, they were very close here. They were about 1.2 million away. They still get 0 points, but they're very close to that. So that looks like they're on the right track. Finishing up the report, financial statement strength looks at, again, the financial strength of the franchisor. Do they have enough to meet their short-term and long-term debt obligations? Is this a brand that's in danger of declaring bankruptcy? We look at system support and expense commitment. What do they say they're doing in their FDD to support their franchisees? Then how much of the spend in their financials actually goes to support that? Transparency is important here too, because if they don't break down the franchisor financials, we can't give them a rating on that. We rate their management team. We rate their minimum net worth and liquidity requirements, both as a function of their relationship with peers and as a function of their initial investment. So what kind of a barrier to entry does this brand provide or present for its potential franchisees? Franchise agreement assessment is one that we talked about in the call already, when we looked at step-in rights and right of first refusal, liquidated damages, anything that we find in that agreement that, again, is a credit concern. It's qualitative, not quantitative. We're going to note that in the franchise agreement assessment here. We got a note about liquidated damages and so on and so forth there. The report that we're going over now is the fund report. This is an independent risk analysis by FRANdata. This is a 4-pay report. This is what all of our subscribers have access to. So if you're a subscriber and you're on the call, you know who you are. I was going to read all the names out, but I'm not going to do that. But if you're a subscriber, you know who you are. And for being a subscriber, you have access to all this information, and I'm at your beck and call. So when you email and I see your bank name and you're a subscriber, we start moving right away. So, yep, talked about franchise agreement assessment. And the final category of the report is the projected unit success, where we're taking everything that we've learned from the different categories in the report so far. Transparency plays a role. So if there's no information here, they're getting a 0 in another category, and they're going to get docked in projected unit success. But we try to project forward what we think this brand is going to do in the future and the next unit in the next forward few years. We also talk about any sector and industry headwinds and tailwinds at the bottom of the fund report. So that is a very, very quick and dirty on fund reports, how we at FRANdata analyze franchise performance, and the types of tools that we put into the hands of our subscribers to enable them to do the same. So For folks that are listening, that are interested in fund reports, that are doing volume, that need this kind of support in franchising, I would encourage you to reach out to us. My contact information is here on the screen. Really appreciate you hanging in with me. I thought that we were not going to have enough time, but it looks like that we did. We have about 5 minutes left. Um, any other questions or issues that folks might have? I know sometimes it's a little, you know, it's a little much to kind of air your problems in the webinar chat. But if there's something specific that's bothering you, go ahead and write that, or you can just email me afterwards. So I really appreciate that. Thank you, Riley, for the kudos there. That's about it. We're going to have the recording. I think Melinda's going to do that in a couple of days. You'll get that. And we're, of course, here to help with anything that you need. So go ahead and email us. Thank you for joining and have a wonderful day.